As you can see, I'm on holiday, but the show must go on. I do enjoy white wine, but I drink even more champagne than white wine. Champagne is extremely food-friendly and goes extremely well with a wide variety of foods, and you can even enjoy it during meals from start to finish. In addition, most of the red wines that I enjoy tend to require at least an hour or two in the decanter to open up before I enjoy them. So oftentimes I'll enjoy champagne while I'm waiting for those red wines to open up. As a result, I definitely have a champagne problem, because while I buy more champagne than anything else, I tend to have less of it than anything else, and I'm constantly purchasing new bottles of champagne just to keep up with the use cases and the demand. The problem, however, is that champagne keeps going up in price, and so I'm definitely on the lookout for some alternatives that can offer some of the same qualities and benefits as champagne, but that don't cost as much. So in this video, we're going to do another blind tasting battle. We're going to compare a Crémant that sells for only around $27 to a proper champagne, namely the wildly popular Veuve Clicquot Brut Yellow Label. Before this battle begins, I'll first introduce the competitors. Veuve Clicquot is a historic champagne house that dates way back to 1772. After her husband died in 1805, Madame Clicquot took over the ownership and operation of Veuve Clicquot. The widow Clicquot was actually quite innovative and led to a number of initiatives that greatly improved the quality of champagne and which are still used today, such as the use of the riddling rack. The Veuve Clicquot Brut Yellow Label is a flagship wine for Veuve Clicquot that dates way back to the late 19th century. This is a champagne that uses around 45% reserve wine. It's typically a blend that consists of around 50% Pinot Noir, which can give strength to a blend. They use about 30% Chardonnay, which provides freshness and acidity, and they use about 20% Meunier, which can provide some fruitiness to the wine. Veuve Clicquot tends to age on the lees for around 36 months prior to the time it's disgorged and released. This is a champagne that received an impressive 94-point score from Decanter, but it received 90-point scores from a couple other critics. While Veuve Clicquot is one of the most historic producers of sparkling wine, Henri Champliau, the competitor, is one of the youngest upstarts. In fact, it was founded just in 2016, so it's only been around for about 8 years. Henri Champliau is located in Mercury, which is in the heart of the Côte Chalonnaise in Burgundy. Henri Champliau is a negociant, and so it sources all the fruit for the wine that it produces. It works directly with its producers, and it's extremely selective. While Henri Champliau is interested in acquiring as much high-quality fruit as it possibly can, it actually rejects up to 2/3 of the fruit that it has the opportunity to buy from its growers. So it's extremely selective. While Henri Champliau also makes wine in the tank or Charmat method, we're going to focus on the Crémant de Bourgogne Brut Authentique, which is made in the traditional method, just like with champagne. And so the secondary fermentation takes place in the same bottle that you actually buy. As with the Veuve Clicquot, this is a Pinot Noir dominant champagne. This one consists of 85% Pinot Noir and also 15% Chardonnay. So there's no Meunier in this blend whatsoever. The Henri Champliau receives 15 months of maturation on the lees, which is much less than the 36 months for the Veuve Clicquot, and this one received an impressive 96-point score from Decanter. So Decanter actually rated this one more highly than the Veuve Clicquot. So with that, we're ready to do the tasting. I have these wines poured for me, so I don't know which is which. I'm going to taste through each of them individually and give you my thoughts in sequence. After that, I'm going to compare them and tell you which one I think is better, and also which one I think is which and why. If you're interested in wine recommendations, wine collecting strategies, and learning more about wine, please do subscribe to my channel. I've been collecting wine for more than 15 years and also have a level 4 diploma from the WSET. So I have both formal certification as well as substantial practical knowledge from the School of Hard Knocks. Okay, we're going to start with wine number 1. And off camera, I did compare the color of these wines, and it was quite similar. And so that's not going to tell us much in this particular exercise. So we'll move on to the aromatics. So wine number 1 is not overly fruity. I'm getting some fruit descriptors, however. There's probably subtle lemon and grapefruit. I'm also getting a little bit of apple, but it's more of baked apple, and perhaps peach but it's more like a peach custard or a baked peach and not like a fresh, vibrant peach. The one thing that really jumps out at me is a ginger descriptor, which is kind of interesting. That one's probably the most prominent descriptor that I'm getting at this point. And there's also some of the autolytic descriptors, perhaps croissant. So now we'll give it a taste. I would say that the acidity is probably medium plus for this wine. It's certainly not high, but it's definitely at least medium plus. I would expect that the champagne would have higher acidity than the Crémant de Bourgogne, so that's something we'll keep in mind as we go forward. On the palate, the descriptors are quite consistent with the aromatics. The finish goes on for probably 20 seconds or so. So this is not a super long finish, but it's definitely more than respectable, because I would consider at least 15 or so to be average or at least acceptable. This wine is not overly complex. There's a little bit of a rustic quality to it, perhaps something that's a little bit like a baking soda type smell to it. So those are my initial thoughts just from this quick evaluation of wine number 1. Right, so here's wine number 2. So for this one, I'm getting a little bit more grapefruit, some lemon, some lime, perhaps a little bit of pear, maybe a little bit of mandarin. I'm also getting some gunflint or smokiness, which I tend to really enjoy in my sparkling wine. There's also some autolytic descriptors, such as toast and brioche, perhaps a little bit of hazelnut. So we'll give this one a taste. And again, I put my head down like that so I can assess the acidity, which is going to be critical in this analysis. When you feel mouth-watering sensations on the side of your tongue, that's how you can assess acidity. And so the more your mouth waters and the longer that it waters, the higher the acidity in a particular wine. And so I definitely get a little bit more acidity in wine number 2 than wine number 1. I would say that wine number 2 definitely has high acidity. On the palate, certainly the descriptors are consistent with the aromas. This one does have a slightly longer finish than wine number 1 as well. Also, I noticed that there were a number of numerous discrete descriptors. I was able to identify more discrete descriptors for wine number 2 than wine number 1. And typically, the more descriptors you can identify, the more complex a particular wine is. Whereas if you have a wine that's a little bit less complex, you might have more muddled descriptors, so you might get citrus fruits rather than specific citrus notes like orange, grapefruit, lemon, and so forth. So those are my thoughts regarding wine number 2. Now we're to the portion of the video where I try to identify which wine is which, and also which wine I like better, and explain why. When I'm comparing champagne to a non-champagne sparkling wine, there's several potential distinguishing characteristics that I will emphasize. And I've tried to foreshadow those a little bit along the way. One of them is the presence of the autolytic descriptors, so characteristics such as toast, brioche, nuttiness, and so forth. With champagne, you'd expect longer maturation on the lees, and so you'd have more pronounced autolytic descriptors. In addition, champagne tends to be a little bit cooler, certainly than regions like Burgundy, and so you'd expect that the champagne would have higher acidity than the Crémant de Bourgogne. In addition, just due to the length of the maturation process, you would expect that the champagne would be a little bit more complex than the Crémant, and so it would be a little bit more refined and perhaps have a longer, more complex finish. By applying these factors to the 2 wines that I just tasted, my opinion is that wine number 1 will be the Crémant de Bourgogne, and wine number 2 will be the Veuve Clicquot. Again, this is because I think wine number 1 has a little bit lower acidity than wine number 2. It lacks a little bit of the refinement that wine number 2 has. Wine number 2 also has more pronounced and prominent autolytic characteristics. So I definitely think that wine number 2 is the Veuve Clicquot. So now we're ready for the reveal of wine number 1. Sure enough, as expected, wine number 1 was the Henri Champliau Crémant de Bourgogne. And wine number 2 is the Veuve Clicquot. Just because I was able to distinguish between these two wines doesn't mean that I prefer one of them over the other. I do think that wine number 2, the Veuve Clicquot, had more complexity and is probably the better wine if I was just assessing quality levels. However, we also have to take into account the fact that it costs at least double the price of wine number 1, and in many instances, at least triple. And so each of you will need to decide for yourselves the extent to which you're willing to pay up for that little extra level of refinement and complexity and acidity that you would get for the Veuve Clicquot, and that would not be present for this Crémant de Bourgogne. But I can certainly say that this Crémant de Bourgogne, at least in my opinion, is a huge step up from wines such as Prosecco and other sparkling wines that are made in the Charmat or tank method. And it's also a most respectable example of a sparkling wine made in the traditional method. So certainly if you're looking for a sparkling wine that sells for around $27 per bottle, this is definitely an excellent choice. As for the Veuve Clicquot, while it was arguably the winner of this blind tasting battle, it certainly did not overwhelm wine number 1, and there's definitely many more champagnes, even at the $50 price point, that I would probably prefer to this particular champagne. If you'd like to know what champagnes I do recommend at some of the lower price points, please be sure to check out this video that's linked above.